David, welcome to the Boundless Body podcast. Really good to have you.
Great to be here. Thanks.
Yeah. Really stoked. David Bridel is an artist, a scholar, and an author, as well as an educator whose expertise ranges from screen to stage, instruction to leadership. He has been teaching clown, mask, movement, and performance for 30 years. And he is the founding and artistic director of the Clown School in Los Angeles, as well as the author and co-editor of Clowns, In Conversation, and Send in the Clowns, Humanitarian Clowning in Crisis Zones. So I had the pleasure of doing a clown teacher training with Dr. Bridel, Dr. Clown Bridel.
Yes.
And just am really, really excited to have you on the show, David. So I'm really interested to hear about your process in putting together Send in the Clowns. And it's a big question to start with, but I think it's just a really important question for our really fragmenting political times. How humorless, how fragmenting, and how polarized the political situations in the world are, and how the clown can serve the process of healing those splits and that fragmentation. So I love the book. I just think it's so important. Can you talk to us a little bit about the clown as a figure who can support the big picture healing on planet Earth?
Sure. I can try.
Start with the big questions.
Yeah, but we'll start big and go small. Well, I think it's important, first of all, to contextualize the idea of clowning, because we tend to think of it in relation to the circus being the great, 19th century juggernaut that sort of established clowning in the media culture of that time. And to this day, most people think of clowns as having wigs and red noses and big shoes. And I call it like the Ronald McDonald look. It's an easy touch point. So it's always helpful to remind people that clowning was around long before the circus, long before the image that we associate with the clown became popularized. And in fact, long before entertainment existed as a phenomenon, there was clowning. And we know from our studies of indigenous cultures and what I call original clowning, which reaches back thousands of years, that the original function of the clown was to, and I quote, balance the cosmos. So in rituals, communal celebrations, harvest, marriage, funeral, transition of season, the clowns always materialized and appeared and would provide the profane that would balance out the sacred. So whereas the priests of those cultures would channel our spiritual aspirations, the clowns would ridicule those same aspirations and bring things down to earth with a bump. So it's healthy and helpful to understand that the true clown impulse in our species is to counter sacredness. And we can talk a lot about what sacredness is today as opposed to a couple of thousand years ago, because I think it's a really interesting conversation. But before we get to that, this is a kind of basic definition. The clown is the carrier of the profane and also a creature of reversal or opposition. So in any given community, whether it's a community of one or a community of an entire country or state, if there's an agreed direction, and the clown will always counter that by looking at in the opposite direction. So when it comes to the question of what do humanitarian clowns do, I'm going to borrow from one of those clowns that I interviewed, a man named David Barashi, who works for the Dream Doctors, which is an amazing medical clown organization. And he put it very simply, and I think it's really a wonderful way to consider the role of the clown in these kinds of contexts. He said, if I go into a hospital and the atmosphere that I encounter is chaotic. There's panic and there's unrest, and there's kind of a sense of, things are out of control, then my job is to bring peace and harmony. However, if I go into a hospital and I find stasis, boredom, and an absence of energy, then my job is to provide chaos. So in that very simple definition, we already have a really good picture of how the clown's opposition contextualizes any given environment and balances any given cosmos. So we can start there. We can say that the art of the humanitarian clown is to do the opposite in a given circumstance. And typically those given circumstances for humanitarian clowns are places of unhappiness, disassociation, by which I mean a lack of connection with everyday life, with everyday comforts, and depression and despair. So clown seems like the perfect figure to provide the opposite to those things by showing up and offering joy, laughter, and in contemporary terms, entertainment to people who are suffering. So if the opposite of suffering is joy, then that's what the clown is there to do. So whether it's in a hospital, a crisis zone, a refugee camp, or anywhere where there is where human beings face challenges, clowns make a really good counterpoint.
What could you offer us an image of a concrete sense of what it would look like for a clown to come onto the scene where there's conflict and there's polar opposition and there's either too much chaos or too much order, but just like a little parable or anecdote of an example?
Sure.
Yeah.
Well, I'll take it from, there's many, but I'll take it from two places. The first is an organization based out of the UK called the Flying Seagull Project, which is a group of steampunk clowns who make it their business to go into refugee camps, usually around the fringes of mainland Europe. For example, in Greece, where there are a lot of refugees on islands coming from North Africa, and to provide entertainment and opportunities for laughter and creativity for kids who have been displaced. So what actually happens is that the Flying Seagulls, who, amongst other things, are very musical, will show up in a refugee camp, having organized everything in advance with the relevant administration, and will conduct a parade around that camp. That parade consists of their company, which is, 8 to 10 clowns, maybe less, maybe a bit more, walking through the camp, playing music, dressed in their case, in these kind of glorious cod Edwardian outfits, and making a racket in order to attract children. And it doesn't take long. There's soon crowds of kids like hanging on their coattails, and they give them drums and whistles and they start banging along. And before long, you have a sort of cacophonic parade going on. And the seagull clowns will then direct the kids into a sort of central meeting place where everyone gathers, and then they will perform some kind of show. And the show, being typically based in clowning, is very interactive, lots of foolery, and very importantly, lots of examples of the adult clowns messing up, which is a huge part of what clowning consists of. And the kids have a wonderful time. And they, of course, have been cut off from any notion of entertainment as they've been forcibly removed from, wherever their home base might once have been. So you see that example of the parade followed by the show in a lot of refugee camp clowning. There's an organization known as Clowns Without Borders, named after Doctors Without Borders, who uses that model all over the world in refugee camps. So that's my first example of a practical sort of window into what clowns actually do. But I want to give you another one, which is a little different and absolutely fascinating and rather beautiful, I think. There's an individual based in the Ukraine by the name of Jan Rogala, whose professional name is Dr. Clown. And he has a small organization of clowns who once were medical clowns until the Russians invaded. And as soon as that sort of catastrophe struck the country, they understood that their role had immediately changed, and they began transporting displaced persons from the eastern edge of Ukraine, where the conflict was heaviest, back to relative safety in the West, in clown outfits, wearing their red noses and their kind of disheveled uniforms, and they would get people to load up in their little stuff, and they would transport them hundreds of miles a day, making 2 or 3 trips. Rescuers, effectively, sort of almost first responding rescuers. And there's some pretty chilling stories around people that died in the van, and collecting folks who are disabled or in any ways sort of differently able, because the regular buses that were shipping people west were not able to accommodate folks with different abilities. And so, there's a lot of very real trauma surrounding the activities and the actions of these clowns. But once the refugees had been settled in other cities, then the clowns began to wonder, well, what do we do? And I specifically asked Jan, do you do shows for the refugees in your own country? And he said, no. He said, they don't really want that. They're not interested in juggling and hoops or even jokes particularly. So I said, well, then what's left? What can the clown do? And he said, well, mostly I will go into areas that are settled with, densely packed populations of refugees, and I'll just offer hugs. And, in the context of a profound conflict like that, it makes a certain amount of sense. That's the opposite of what those people have just been experiencing. And that's what the role of the clown has become. And it doesn't have to be sophisticated. Yeah. For it to be effective and profound. So I was very moved by that story when I heard it.
Yeah, thank you for that. I was really moved by, and I'm not sure if it was in your book, Humanitarian Clowning, or another one, or a research article on clowning that I met, or that I read. It was a image of a clown coming into a picket line, where you have a picketers, and then you have basically a military situation, and you have like this uncomfortable standoff, where it's just like tensions are high. And then this clown troupe comes in and starts to just kind of loosen the tension.
Yes.
Yeah. Is this ringing a bell? Is this any humanitarian? Yeah.
Yeah, there's 2 people who report on this exact phenomenon. Both of them were originally involved in, or have some connection, I should say, with the CIRCA, which is one of my favorite acronyms ever. It's the Clandestine Insurgent Rebel Clown Army.
Can you say that again, sir?
CIRCA, CIRCA, Clandestine Insurgent Rebel Clown Army. Come on now. That's genius right there. And that originally grew up in the UK, but soon there were chapters of rebel clowns all around Europe, and it's still a movement in different forms. And yeah, the job of those clowns was to show up in sort of activist situations and to do something that I find to be utterly fascinating, which is to kind of probe the borders or the boundaries between 2 different groups. In most cases, as you allude to, the police or the authorities on the one hand, and protesters or activists on the other. But, I went into those conversations, Brian, thinking that the clowns would be just simply on the activist side. And in particular, when I learned that a lot of those clowns have historically been anarchists, then it made sense that, wow, they would be surely part of the sort of activist insurgency in social terms. But actually, it's a little more complex and sort of absurd than that. Because in discussing this with 2 of the most important clowns who have been a part of these movements, Robin Hambrook and Hilary Ramsden are their names, I learned that actually the greatest interest is in the suffusion of, or the reduction of tension, and in kind of exploring boundaries. Now, ridicule and parody is a big part of it, for sure, and it's usually the authorities that deserve that ridicule and parody. But those clowns are not necessarily on the front lines, like sort of, yelling at the authorities and, suggesting revolution. More typically, they're poking fun and creating a third space, what we might think of as a liminal space, right, between two fixed oppositions, and presenting, I think, both parties, the authorities and the protesters, with a kind of a channel of humor, which, as I think you suggested at the beginning, is not very typical in those kind of situations. And I heard this really cool anecdote that I think it was Robin shared with me. This wasn't the Rebel Clown Army, but a group with similar intentions. Extinction Rebellion were conducting a sort of a sit-in somewhere, I don't recall where. And apparently it had become very tense with the police, and arrests were starting to be made, and people were locking themselves to, for gates and fences and what have you. And the atmosphere was slowly worsening between these two groups. Suddenly, out of nowhere, come a group of 4 people dressed as kangaroos with gigantic testicles. Cool. Who found their way into this, into this standoff and began just bouncing around. And nobody could stand how absurd and ludicrous it was, and it really affected the mood of both sides in that moment. So I think that little tidbit is actually very helpful when understanding how the clown's role in that situation is neither to support one side nor the other, but to provide, a different exploration of boundaries, which takes us all the way back to the trickster, of course, and what I think of as the origin of clowning.
Yeah. You were talking about the original clown, and that there's this function of inversion, of turning the table, whatever it is, whether if it's too much chaos, then we're going to bring in the order.
Yeah.
If it's too much order, we're going to bring in the chaos.
Absolutely.
If there's a polarized split and lots of tension, we're going to inhabit the in-between.
Exactly. Yeah.
And I'm thinking about the political binary, right? Which is so rigid. You have, you have Republicans and Democrats, and, liberals and conservatives, and the discourse is so wrought with putrefaction and meanness and othering, and it's far from humor. It's just kind of cataclysmic hatred. It's just so rigid. And so I imagine kind of like this kangaroo with enormous balls coming onto the political scene during the middle of a political debate, and like how to make a space for the third that has real political value. The third thing is often harmonic. You kind of need a third thing to create harmony, like this.
Yeah.
But like how to make a space for that, like on the bigger global level. I mean,
it's a great question. I mean, in contemporary culture, someone that everyone will recognize as a kind of a modern equivalent to a court jester, we have our Jon Stewart, and Stephen Colbert, those kind of people. Now, I suspect that also most would agree that there is a certain agenda that has sort of political overtones. Having said that, I was recently noticing that Jon Stewart specifically was getting flack from both sides because of his determination to call out everybody, for their pomposity and absurdity, and to ridicule all elements of the spectrum. And I think, for the most part, that's something that he endeavors to do. So probably not the dead center, but still someone who's interested in a middle space based on exquisite temptation to ridicule both sides. But to your larger question, Brian, I have no freaking idea how it is that this climate that we are living in right now could potentially be, shall we say, recontextualized at the scale that would be required to have an impact. Yeah, that's a mystery. But of course, it also speaks to the limitations, not just of, shall we say, entertainers, but to the whole notion of entertainment. It's now commodified so profoundly that it's actually perhaps lost touch with, at least the clown or the comedian has lost touch to a certain extent with their original integrated role within any given community. But of course, the whole question of community is a very difficult one nowadays.
It's really interesting to me. You said the word absurdity at least twice. You said the word absurdity in reference to the political apparatus, but you also use the term absurdity in terms of what the clown does. So I'm thinking to myself, gosh, there's absurdity that relieves tension and creates healing and creates integration. And then there's absurdity that doesn't.
Yeah, sure.
It's almost like the clown holds up a mirror to absurdity and makes it see, or attempts to make it see what it is. There's this term that comes from Moshe Feldenkrais, who's a somatic psychologist guy. He has this wonderful phrase called the elusive obvious. Isn't that wonderful?
Yeah, sure.
The elusive obvious. And sometimes I think the clown is actually the archetype of complexity.
Right.
A master and a fool of paradox and complexity.
Well, I couldn't agree with you more. How about this for an example? Francis of Assisi is one of the most well-regarded holy fools in the tradition of foolery within, spirituality or religion. And I was recently reading a book that Dario Fo, the great Italian communist agitator, activist, artist, had written about, or has written about St. Francis. And he delights in this particular anecdote. Somewhere in the early 1200s, there was a lot of civil war in what we now think of as Italy, although it wasn't Italy to them. And Francis was asked, as a renowned sort of courier of peace, he was asked to go, I think it was to Bologna, and give a sermon, effectively, in front of a population who had been ravaged by civil war. The city had been decimated, and neighbors had been murdering neighbors, and what have you. So Francis shows up, and by all accounts, the market square was packed, and everyone was desperately hoping for, the relief that he could bring, owing to his insight, his principles, and his relationship with God. And he stood up in front of the crowd and he said, "War is great. More weapons, more killing, more and more and more." And through this, utterly startling sermon that he gave, which was completely the opposite of what everyone was hoping for, he drew attention to the absurdity and the horror of the actions, if you like, of the ruling classes, which was one of his great motivations or imperatives. So, absurdity, topsy-turviness, doing the opposite, and then ridiculing is such an integral part of what the clown offers that it does yield a great deal of complexity, because parody is teasing whatever is there without a political affiliation. And it's really interesting to think about the clown as being unpolitical, because I think it illuminates a lot about that sort of desire that we have in all of us to simply defuse power wherever we see it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's got like the clown has a sort of sensitive radar for pomposity and arrogance, and that is going to be showing up on all sides pretty much.
Yeah, exactly.
And it's going to, without any prioritization of any side, it's the dynamic of the grandiosity itself that the clown is after.
That is exactly right. I'm working on some writing around this subject, but I think the thing that the clown is duty bound to attack in any format is dogma, is our sort of innate disposition towards dogmatizing whatever it is we think or believe. And in what I would describe as monocultures, in which a single religion or a single political view is, universal or uniform, then clown versus dogma is kind of obvious. It's straightforward. But in a fractured culture, the clown is turning in all directions and seeing dogma everywhere, including, I think, in our personal lives. And the spirit of the clown is there to try to melt or diffuse or sometimes explode any dogma that you or I or any of us are carrying around in our heads, whether that's a political dogma, a social dogma, or even an emotional dogma. And I think that's why the clown has become such a popular figure in the sort of contemporary artistic landscape and in the humanitarian landscape, because of its ability to undermine structures, including the ones that we carry around on our own backs.
In many indigenous creation mythologies, you have the trickster being a fundamental force in the universe that is part of creating the great everything.
That's right.
Often in a disjointed dance with the structure bearers, where you have these deities that are, sort of building lineages and building order and building shapes in the universe, and the trickster comes in and mucks it up.
Yeah, that's exactly.
When indigenous ritual technologies, you have a playing out of these primordial forces, chaos and order. And in that dance, you have a kind of equal power, or a toggling back and forth between, dominance and submission, between chaos and order.
Absolutely.
And it's a creative tension, a creative tug of war. And then, so you have the clown, or the original clown, kind of coming in when there's an ordered ritual happening, and everything that needs to be placed just so, and it needs to go just like this. And then after this thing happens, then this thing needs to happen, where the orator or the priest does this thing, and then there's that thing. And then the clown comes in, and who knows what's going to happen.
Yeah.
Right. But the thing is that there's the power is, it ignites, right? Because there's a type of symmetry to it.
That's right.
And then, and now, like in our political era, where the sacred canopy is collapsed, the third thing of the clown has no power, really.
Yeah.
And it's tragic that because it needs the balance. It needs the mucky muck to come in and to loosen things up. I find it to be a tragedy that there's not a third thing, that, like the satire, news radios. And I really love the Bugle podcast. For you Bugle listeners out there, the Bugle podcast is just hilarious, but it's very marginal. It's not like an image of these big, powerful, figures with big money, big power, so that they come in as a third thing as a balance to shake up the structural status quo. And we need that, but it's almost like it's so contrary to the image of power accumulation that it makes sense that it's not accumulating power, but it needs to, I think.
I agree. I mean, it's funny, when I was growing up in the UK, there was a magazine that was very popular especially among the ruling classes, called Private Eye, which was a parodic magazine which would rip the shit out of everybody, both sides, with only delight. And of course, in the United States, The Onion actually, is a tiny version of that same impulse, and it's rather wonderful in its own way. But you're right. I mean, these sort of little flickers are just a drop in the ocean in comparison to the scale of the power structures that we face today. So no answers on that front, except to say this, that whenever I practice clowning in the classroom, and frequently when I encounter clowns who have either witnessed or been through clown training themselves, there's regularly a sentiment that gets expressed, which is everyone should do this, especially the people that, sort of occupy positions of authority, because it's humbling in its own way.
I think it's pretty natural, but for even the people that have a lot of structural power and money or whatever, a simple, a place where the clown shows up in simple everyday life is parents playing with their children.
Absolutely. absolutely.
And then, so we have this big split between public and private, where the public sector, it's all this structural power and I'm right and, and all this stuff. And I'm going to prove how you're wrong. And, it's just one-upmanship all the way down. But then in the private life, I would venture to guess that a lot of these folks know how to play decently with their kids. It's like the simple act of the clown playing with kids, right?
Yeah.
That's what it's children as its natural habitat.
I agree. I mentioned earlier the Ukrainian clown who is just giving hugs to people that need hugs. I've heard of that in India as well. But you just reminded me that I recently encountered this article that suggested that well-adjusted children are children who have been touched healthily a lot in their early years. And the examples of touching that were given were cuddling, hugging, and tickling. And, all of those are somewhere connected to the sort of clown impulse in a parent, right? But you think about tickling a child, which is the most heavenly thing to do. Off they are in peals of laughter, and it's, everyone's having a wonderful time. And it's a moment of real connection. So I do think that, amongst other things, we've talked a lot about parody and satire, but there's this other very, very humanitarian element to clowning, which is simply about human connection. And you're absolutely right. From parent to child is a place where we should get to practice that, I hope.
Here we meet with that paradox again of simplicity and complexity.
Mm-hmm. That's right.
Where the simple gesture of tickling is just it's a simple joy shared by so many. And then it can also, and the clown, I think, knows this, the clown in us knows this, that it also can ramp up massively into complexity. For example, caregivers that aren't well-attuned caregivers will go past the moment when they're tickling their children, when the child basically says stop, and then the parent can't get that because they're not attuned. They don't get that signal. So they basically, the tickling toggles into abuse.
Yeah, that's right. Absolutely. Yeah.
And then it becomes really, really complex, because then we can't say any longer in any simple way that tickling is always going to be good. Right?
No, that's right. It has to be reciprocal. And for reciprocity, you need connection and you need sensitivity. So those are elements of your sort of clown training. I mean, an audience, whether it's in a circus, in a theater, or on a street, an audience is always the partner to the clown. And the clown has to learn to read that audience and play with it up to its limits, but not beyond. I recently read this wonderful sentence. It was actually about holy fools, which we mentioned earlier. The function of the holy fool is to test the limits of our rituals. And it's not to say to explode them or to destroy them, but rather just to kind of push at the boundaries and see, are they holding water or are there any leaks? So, I totally agree. Sensitivity, reciprocity, and connection are absolutely fundamental to this practice.
One of the things that I really appreciate about you, David, is when I was doing my clown teacher training with you, we had several discussions about this era of trauma and trauma treatment that we're embedded in. And, I'm a trauma specialist. I'm a somatic psychologist. I work with trauma every day. I teach about the nervous system. And this is just the bread and butter of my everyday life. This trauma discourse, and it was intuitive to you. And that's one of the things that I really loved about talking with you. This obsession and all this talk about trauma and intergenerational trauma, it's become humorless. And so how to be in right relationship with trauma-sensitive communities, trauma-sensitive practitioners. I'm an expert in trauma resolution. I work with this every day, but I still feel like it is an absolutely essential thing that a person can get in touch with their playfulness. I'm about training practitioners that have a sense of humor so that they're not running a sort of dogmatic model of what a person should or shouldn't do with their traumatic experience. So, and that was just my best attempt to summarize, a couple of hours of conversation or more that we dedicated to this topic. But
Yeah.
wondering, with my prompt that that I'm sending over to you right now, where could you take it now in this moment?
Well, I'm thinking about the relationship between the past and the present. I mean, obviously, if trauma is occurring in the present, we're in a whole other ballgame. But for the most part, what I hear you referring to is the existence of trauma in a person's history, which remains obviously current in their everyday experience, but is not actually happening now. And all I can say about that, without having the training or the background that you do, is that I think the clown helps to identify elements of a person's identity or personality that are fabricated or constructed through, shall we say, lived experience, as opposed to sort of innate qualities. So the lived experience of trauma formulates a piece of a person's identity, right? And clowning challenges, sometimes very gently and playfully, any aspect of our identity that we are fixating upon. And the way that it does that is not through dialogue such as you and I are conducting right now, although this is fantastic, but it's through embodied practice. So, for example, if I ask you to sit down opposite another human being and chuckle while maintaining eye contact with them for 2 or 3 minutes, then energies and vibrations are liberated that might, and it's only a possibility, that might either counter or recontextualize some piece of your sort of quote unquote fixed personality, which is not actually fixed, that you are carrying around with you on a daily basis that may have, its historical origin. And of course, I gave you that tiny example of chuckling with one another, which I use a lot, but there's hundreds of examples in the clown classroom of opportunities for a person to reinvent themselves through play. And my clown teacher, Philippe Gaulier, who's still practicing, famously said to one of his students who became a great clown, "I don't give a shit about your personality," which is both a sort of a horrifyingly direct way of saying something, but also a fascinating sentiment. What does that mean? And I recognize that in the arts, we toss things around somewhat liberally, and they may not have quite as much, shall we say, kind of authentic study or academic grounding as the folks in your universe. But nevertheless, take it for what it's worth. I don't give a shit about your personality. That's really curious. And although I wouldn't use that language myself by any means, some aspect of that point of view, maybe your personality is more fluid than you think, the way I'd like to put it. That I hope is a window of opportunity for anyone, including those of us who are carrying trauma around from our backgrounds. Does any of that make sense?
Totally. And, clown, I think we're agreeing that it's this mobile, nomadic field that's able to go onto both sides and appreciate paradox and move towards a third space when there's opposition. So it would be easy for a really mobile clown to include the other side of that.
Right.
I don't give a shit about your personality, and I give every shit about your personality.
Absolutely.
And then there's a place that's neither.
Yeah.
And or both.
Exactly.
That where it's like, because that's one of the complexities when working with traumatized bodies. You have traumatized identities, you have marginalized cultures, marginalized ethnicities, marginalized races, marginalized bodies. And that identity has been put upon and subjugated structurally by structural powers.
That's right.
So, and that's not funny.
No.
And the clown, the well-attuned clown knows that that is not funny. So it's not going to be like, hey, boo, 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 get, your personality,
Right.
sucks and we need to deconstruct that, right? No. That's when it would be hugging turn or coming back to order And doing the skill set that so many trauma resolution folks are interested in, which is self-regulating,
Mhm.
helping people to self-regulate, helping people to internalize a sense of sovereignty and agency, and to structuralize a self,
Mhm.
that is robust,
Mhm.
that has strength and resilience. But then also the other side of that is that when identity over time starts to gather, kind of iron filings,
Sure.
but the magnet of that structure of identity can become really humorless. And there can be, in the attempt to create safety, and it's a really good intention to create safety. Like, we need to feel safe before play is going to happen at all, or if
Mhm.
there's any possibility for play, we need to feel safe. But there can be this like obsession with safety. And I like to say that too much safety is unsafe.
Yeah, sure.
What do you think about that one?
Well, I think that's an interesting proposition. Um, I'm typically working myself in a classroom that contains predominantly either performers or people who have already contracted with themselves and me that they will tolerate performance, even if they don't come from that background and have no ambitions in that direction. So, uh, but so safety, so the willingness to kind of push safety is often, but not always, implicit with the people that walk into my rooms. But you are reminding me a great deal of medical clowning and hospital clowning when you discuss this topic of the traumatized body, the systems that exist to both reinforce that trauma and to kind of name it as such. Imagine being, just for the sake of argument, imagine being a child who is either suffering from a significant or serious disease or has had a significant injury. When you're in a hospital, you're really at the mercy of absolutely everybody. In fact, to a certain extent, you become a number. You have a chart, used to be on the end of your bed. Now I'm sure it's digital, but nevertheless, there's a chart that defines your illness or your injury. And every activity that happens around you is centered on that injury or illness. So one of the rules of medical clowning that I learned, or practices, I should say, which fascinated me, is the idea that the clown never asks a patient how they are. And it's just a sort of fantastically simple reinforcement of the fact that how are you is directly connected to your trauma. And it's either going to, it doesn't matter where the answer is, it's still circling that topic. So the clown's work is different. It's kind of soul-based, and the soul that is encountered in the hospital can have a mild injury, no injury at all, every injury in the world, can be about to die, can have a heavy cold. It doesn't matter, because the soul is the target of the clown's quote-unquote treatment. And I've noticed that so many reports around medical clowning reveal that the the relief that is offered through this practice is not exclusively experienced by a patient, but it also infects, to coin a phrase, nurses, doctors, caregivers, and family. So there's a couple of examples of this that I'd love to give. One is, I learned this from a Brazilian clown, one of his first encounters with a sick child, a sort of a truculent teenager, was he went into a room where the child was in a bed, and the clown said, "May I come in?" And the kid said, "No." And in a very grumpy mood, just said, "No." And the clown obeyed him and chose to exit the room. But then he stood in the corridor for a few minutes, scratching his head, and thought to himself, that didn't go very well. Well, what can I do? Because if I just walk away, I mean, it's an option, but I would like to try something else. So in the end, he chose to simply open the door again and ask the exact same question, "Can I come in?" And the kid looked at him as if he was stupid and said, "No, I told you you can't." And the clown was like, "Oh, okay." And out he went, and using the old axiom, third time's the charm, he was like, let's give this one more shot. So he opened the door again. He said, "Can I come in?" And the kid starts to smile and says, "How many times do I have to tell you? You're not going to come into my room." But something was already changing. The vibration, the game had sort of begun to materialize. So according to the report of this clown, they played that game for about 40 minutes. But at the end of which, the kid was having the best possible time of his life. But think about it, Brian, agency, right? That kid is told where to go, when to go, what to eat, when to exercise, when not to exercise, lie down, take this, do that. That's the only experience that the kid has of agency. And for those who might argue, well, what about art therapy or music therapy? Yes, but it's passive. You can have a violinist come in and play a beautiful piece of Bach, but the kid doesn't get any agency out of that. They do get an emotional experience, but they don't embody a sense of authority that they're missing. So the clown is a unique figure in that context. And that leads me to this incredible story that Dush Barashi told me, the same clown that I mentioned earlier from the Dream Doctors. He was told that a young boy had cancer and was going to die, also a teenager, about 14 years old. And of course, everyone was treating this kid with kid gloves, walking around on on hot coals, and like, "Are you okay? How are you? What can I get you?" Blah blah blah. And so the clown, takes in the situation and says, "Well, I'm not going to do any of that because he has plenty of it, and I don't think it's helping." So he's introduced to the kid, and the clown says, "So you're going to die, huh?" And the kid looks at him with wide eyes and says, "Yes," as if to say, "You can't bring that up. How dare you bring that up?" The clown says, "So what do you want to do?" And the kid's like, "Are you serious?" And the clown's like, "Yeah, what do you want to do?" So he thinks for a bit and he says, "Well, I want to go on a date." And the clown says, "That's a great idea." And the kid says, "Well, I can't. I'm in a hospital. How am I going to go on a date?" The clown says, "We're going to make a video. And that video you can send to girls. And, hopefully you'll get lucky." So they set up a little studio. The clown's holding his phone and the kid's in a corner somewhere. And the kid's like, "Hi, my name is so-and-so, and, blah, blah, blah." And the clown says, "Tell him that you're ill. Tell him you're going to die." And the kid says, "Well, how can I do that?" The clown says, "It's the only way you're going to get laid." So the upshot of the story is the kid makes the video. He doesn't get a girlfriend or anything like that, but he does share it with his buddies who are his peers. And they're like, "That's the bravest thing I've ever seen." And so he gets a little bit of a little kudos for this experiment that he conducted. But so, the clown can't change fate. The clown can't reverse, the path of the universe. But to recontextualize trauma in a body that is ridden with cancer by treating the individual inside of that trauma, that's sort of beneath the armor of that trauma, if I'm not being too poetic and ridiculous. That's the function of clowning, and I think it's kind of astonishing.
Yeah, beautiful. Thank you for that. It's very touching. So there's this rubric, this obsession with self-regulation in the trauma resolution community. Self-regulation is a necessary thing. We need to be able to come back home, especially when things are getting chaotic or conflictual. Back to this idea of complexity, there's always two sides. So there's self-regulation and there's exploration. There's adventure, and there needs to be more than just, establishing the secure base. People want to adventure. They want to take risks. And,
Yeah. Well, I was just thinking, it's a silly analogy, but I think it's helpful. You can't have a secure base if you're only standing on one leg. And, the idea that regulation is the only answer, it sort of cuts out the potential for balance, right? And of course, I understand that dysregulation may be absolutely terrifying and difficult to control and all of those things. So it has to be managed for sure. I'm not suggesting chaos for the sake of it. But I do think that, and I've noticed this in the classroom many a time, that true groundedness occurs when a person is capable of accessing both sides of the question of regulation. So,
yeah, because if I'm always directing a person when things are getting a bit hectic or they're starting to cry, for example, and I'm running in to rescue and slow things down, that's often the modus operandi of the trauma-informed practitioner. Hey, let's slow things down.
Sure.
Let's slow things down. And that's an important skill set. But the thing is, what I've noticed is that some of the most powerful events of healing in my work over 25 years of doing trauma resolution work is that me and the client, me and the patient have somehow found our way into laughter in the middle of the thick of it.
Mm.
Where we're just, I'm not running some model or paradigm where it's polyvagal this, polyvagal that, or, neuroscience informed. Now, all that stuff is great stuff, but we've just, for some reason, we've found our way into the absurdity of it. We've stumbled our way into the absurdity, the tragic comedy.
Sure.
And it's like these moments where the person's really disorganized and I could be doing all these flowing things down on, and then I just say something and I don't even know where it comes from. I don't even know how this stuff can be taught. I mean, you teach this stuff. I do my best to teach, sensitive practitioners that have a sense of humor and whatnot, but then things being said just come out naturally. They just come out in the flow. And I'm telling you that some of the most profound moments in my career as a trauma resolution practitioner is we've just stumbled our way into just hilarity in the middle of this, in the middle of the trauma vortex.
Well, our sense of the ridiculous is truly a saving grace, right? And, back to our discussion about the culture that we live in, it's not that difficult to find examples of people in the public eye who are unable to appreciate what is ridiculous about themselves. And sometimes entire societies are based on that very unfortunate premise. For example, in communist Russia in the early 1970s, there was a clown named Leonid Engibarov who was very popular, circus clown. And you look back at his performances now, because you can access them through YouTube, and they're not particularly radical, but in the context of a society that was absolutely, highly successfully suppressed and repressed around the notion of humorlessness. It was literally a function of communism in that form. It's actually kind of liberating to watch a guy behave like a twit, stumble and fall and put his clothes on upside down and inside out and the wrong way around. It just becomes a reminder, we're deeply flawed. There's no such thing as being a perfect human. There's no such thing as a perfect opinion. There's no such thing as perfect health, etc. So appreciating, understanding, accessing the nature of our being through the lens of ridicule is just profoundly healthy, I think.
Mm-hmm. So it was really intuitive to you in our early conversations that, hey, I'm writing this book and I'm going to be training body psychotherapists. I already do train body psychotherapists. It was really intuitive for you when I said, hey, I want to throw in a clown training in there, and it was intuitive for you. You're like, oh, great. Let's get to work on that. But it might not be as intuitive for other folks. Like, why would it be useful for a therapist to have a clown skill set in their tool bag where they can kind of like, where is that thing? And why would that be useful? It'd be very counterintuitive to some therapists out there.
Yeah, well, I would start by saying, strangely enough, there's been an uptick in the number of people in mental health who show up in clown class nowadays, a notable uptick. So I think the notion that the sort of clown philosophy could be of value is slowly but surely taking root in the mental health world. But to your question, there's many answers. I think we've touched on several of them, but something we haven't really addressed is the fact that, once again, attacking, if you like, or moving beyond the cliche of the clown purely as a physical comedian. Clowning is a very emotional state. And when we train clowns, we have to train people to be able to create access to their emotional lives, to reveal them, accept them, and share them in the present moment, and then to make fun with them. I shouldn't say to make fun of them, although that might be maybe that happens from time to time when everyone is a willing party, but to make fun with them. This approach to our emotional lives, which is not particularly rooted in any academic theory, but is just based on the practice of clowning as a kind of an emotional connective vibration between performer and audience. That's a really, really rich territory, I think, which the therapists that I've met and talked to in my classrooms have reported on that as being really valuable to them. It's embodied, of course, so we take emotion away from any settlement. It's made in the mind, and we move it through the whole system. We refer to emotions without any pejorative language. So you could be furious, you could be delighted, you could be embarrassed, you could be, proud. It doesn't matter. Every one of them has value, equal value as a creative source. And in the embodiment, we become larger than life with those feelings. We turn them into characters. We turn them into sort of living archetypes. And that is all, I think, relevant to the practice of a therapist without me knowing precisely what that practice is. But as I've listened to reports coming back to me, that's what I've noticed.
Yeah. So one of the things that I like to say is that if you don't learn to play with aggression, aggression will play you.
Oh, wow.
And the reason why I'm saying that is that aggression is particularly difficult because there's this double bind in culture and especially white Eurocentric culture, where you have this double bind where it's kind of simultaneously conflict obsessed and repressed. And there's like so much rigidity around and a toggling back and forth, too much conflict, too much rigidity, or conflict avoidance. And so when I say this statement, hey, we got to learn to play with aggression rather than aggression playing you. Now, one alternative in the therapeutic arts and sciences is, hey, when you're feeling aggression, I'm going to teach you to regulate yourself. Now, that's good, okay, but what you're saying, and I think this is absolutely essential, is then what next? If it's just about regulating aggression and then we build a character structure around that, and then everything is about regulation and trying to put a damper on everybody else's aggression. Hey, that was my thing about nonviolent communication in the early days. I got into nonviolent communication. I was like, this is great. Empathy structures and communication structures, people are regulating. And then I got to thinking, and I was feeling after a while, this structure is really violent. Because the person that had the most technology, knew the technology the most and knew the linguistics and the structure and the order, they were the structure bearer, and they held the power of regulating other people's emotions. So, hey, you come into our regulating structure, and we're just going to do regulation on you.
Yeah, sure.
And I was like, I can't even breathe in here. I can't even breathe, and then I found psychodrama and I found a mentor. It's all about spontaneity training. At least in the early days, psychodrama was all about spontaneity training, and I could finally breathe again. And I was like, and then I can play with aggression. So to me, regulating aggression, that's a good step in the process of moving out of being played by aggression.
Right.
But the next stage, I think it needs to be there. I think that the therapists that are coming to you are intuiting this. Well, I need to be able to have a creative outlet about it. I need to be able to learn to play with aggression once I've learned how to regulate it. Or the two of them require each other on the path of growth.
Oh, I love that you said that. Yeah. So it may not be sequential, right? It may be that the creative pathway and the regulatory pathway are actually running, together, or are the same. There's a very brilliant American clown by the name of David Shiner, who worked in Europe for many years with Cirque du Soleil eventually, and then with Bill Irwin on Broadway in a piece that was quite well known. It won a Tony called Full Moon. And Shiner is a very aggressive clown. In fact, I recall I co-taught a masterclass with him once, and he stood up in front of a group of very eager students. And his first question before he said anything else is he said, "You want to know where comedy comes from?" And he said it with a bit of attitude, and all these kids were wide-eyed, and they were like, where? And he said, "Ch-." And that's his truth, for whatever reason in his history, there's a lot of anger. But he channels it into this very startling, somewhat unnerving, but utterly brilliant clown persona. And I suspect, I can't be sure, I don't know him very well by any stretch, but I suspect that that's been an outlet for him that has really, provided health where anger can often lead to dis-ease, provided ease instead of dis-ease. So I think there are practical examples out there in the clown universe of exactly what you just stated, and I couldn't agree with you more.
Yeah, because the political apparatus is just struck through with so much aggression.
Mm-hmm.
And it might be regulated aggression, right? Because they're not like going off into rage fits, although that happens sometimes, right? But it's so contained and rigid, and it's not, and aggression is still playing the whole apparatus rather than the apparatus being able to play with it creatively and actually have interesting conversations, right?
Yeah, but you've said something so fascinating when you're talking about, these models that you learned and how you noticed that they eventually led to just sort of entrenched power structures, because the question becomes not what is the method, but the question becomes what's the apparatus? How can we construct something that is so flexible and, kind of capable of turning itself inside out that it doesn't become dogmatic or hierarchical? And that must be a big question for everybody.
I remember shortly after I took my training with you, and I got my initiation from you, and from you, and it's as initiations go, it's a process. But I had my red nose, and I decided I was going to go to a dance and bust out my red nose, and really just go for it. So I got rainbow tights,
Nice.
and I got a blue wig. And then I got a red nose, and I came rocking up to the dance, and started to just do my thing, and this is one of these ecstatic dances where you have, this kind of people go to do their thing, and it's, you don't often see red noses and weirdos like me traipsing about. And so I come and I traipse onto the scene, and and immediately the children come towards me. Almost immediately. And the children start to orbit around me like I'm the center of a solar system or something like that. We just started to go off into this dream, and we're doing this fun stuff, and they're chasing me around and stuff like that. And then there's this really interesting moment, David, during this, what do you want to call it? Tablio, where the children all of a sudden started to spank me.
Exactly.
And they actually started to get really aggressive.
Yeah.
And it got to a point where it actually stopped being funny. And I started to like literally run away from them. Where I was kind of guiding them into this mutual, it was like quite fun, and like we're playing back and forth, and everybody, and like even the adults were starting to come in a little bit. And then the children started to come after me. And for a while it was fun, and I was like playing it, and I was kind of doing my thing. They're after me. And that was fun for a while. Yeah. Then they like crossed this line into, we're going to come after this guy. And like again and again and again. And after a while, I just took my wig off and my nose off, and I was like, I'm tired.
Right. Yeah.
I got to thinking to myself later, I was like, what is that? What is that about? And after some days of reflection, I thought to myself, gosh, they must have just felt safe to bring their aggression through. and like they had clogged pipes or
Yeah,
something like
that's
that.
exactly it.
Because it was especially the girl, to be honest,
Right.
that
Interesting.
and that they just felt safe to do it. So they just like blasted the cork out of the bottle and it just came after me. What do you think about that?
I agree with you. That's my suspicion anyway. And it's, you know, in the first part of the story where it's all really fun, we can appreciate that you provided through your image a kind of a window of opportunity for these kids to practice opposition, to sort of break free of their norm, which is, as we've already discussed, a huge part of the clown impulse. So they joined you in, you know, absurdity, reversal, upside downness, because that's the image you'd presented for them. And then you played with them. So it only encouraged that. But then I suppose, and this is where you know better than I, but I kind of agree with your assessment that perhaps if there's too much latent opposition that has been kind of stored up and unreleased or unaddressed, then it runs the risk of, you know, overbalancing in the direction of release. And maybe that's what you were confronted with on that day.
I think, yeah, what it was is it started to spiral into more and more chaos, more and more chaos. And then I think I was met with, all right, for me to maintain my role of doing inversions.
Yes.
Actually, the right role would be for me to take off the clown
There you
stuff and
go.
then just provide a center for the kids now that things had spiraled into aggressive chaos.
That makes perfect sense. And it's a wonderful example. We were just speaking about apparatuses, right? How they have to remain totally flexible and, to your earlier comment, spontaneous. So the apparatus functions until it stops functioning, and then you have to shift it. There would have been zero value in you trying to continue in that moment to clown your way through that, but somehow attempt to redirect them. It wouldn't have worked. Obviously, it didn't work. So we've really actually, in this sort of humble anecdote, putting our finger on something that I think is really essential, which is that ultimately the flexibility of the clown principle is in the notion that everything has its opposite, including what happens when you reach that opposite. And that means it's always moving. It's permanently fluid and it's never fixed. So there can be no dogma.
Thanks for that. Another emotion that shows up that really puts a plug on mobility and flexibility is the emotion of shame.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I imagine like this must be core for your work, the encounter, because you had said before that the clown is all about learning how to mess up and playing with messing up. Can you talk to us about the clowning approach to shame? Because psychotherapy's attempts to loosen shame are limited in my perspective. And I think clowning really has something going in terms of encountering messing up and shame, which is just, what have you learned about that? What tools do you use to help people break free from that shame prison?
Yeah. Well, let's start with Laurel and Hardy. So coming out of the mid to late circus tradition is the idea that two clowns, not just one, but two clowns, can function in a really interesting creative opposition with one another. And there are two clown archetypes, consequently. There's actually more than two, but I prefer to just focus on these two because it's very straightforward. We have the clown archetype that is known for arcane circus reasons as the Joey, which is the high status clown. Then we have the clown archetype, which is known for other arcane circus reasons as the Auguste, which is the low status clown. And these clown archetypes have different terms across the world, but they all come down to the same premise, which is one is high and one is low. So Oliver Hardy is a high status clown. Stan Laurel is a low status clown. Oliver Hardy thinks of himself from the sort of root emotion of pride. That is to say, pretty much everything he does as he sort of flickers his fingers around like this and wears that smug expression is supported by that predominant base emotion of like, I'm pretty good. And it could be argued that everything that Stan Laurel does is based in the opposite emotion, which is shame, which is, I don't think I'm any good at all. And these two feelings, emotions, or fixtures, if you like, pride and shame, which are oppositions, are of great value to clown practice. So when I take people through a curriculum which is about character building, clown character building, I will ask them to build 2 clowns each. So Brian, if you were in that class, I'd say, Brian, over the course of our sessions together, you're going to build a proud clown and you're going to build a shamed clown. And you'd get the experience of doing both of those things. And I would ask you to try and pull the images that you would build into clown characters from your real life experience. So when I deal with shame clowns, I don't really use that as a term, but I'm using it for easy reference with you. I often see people coming in as if they were children, wearing school uniforms that are too small for them, or in some way kind of clothes that make them look absurd and lower their status. Sometimes people also wear kind of disheveled clothing. I recently had a shame clown that was like a sort of a washed up housewife look. Sometimes people will wear too tight clothing that reveals themselves in ways that they don't typically want to reveal themselves because they're ashamed of their bodies. But however you go about it, the practice is to kind of allow yourself the liberty of taking this root experience and theatricalizing it and sharing it. And I don't do this at the very beginning of a curriculum because it would be too much too soon. But after we've built some trust and built a community together, then we can start to get into this very difficult subject. And to this day, some will tell me this is one of the most liberating experiences I've ever had, and some will tell me this is too difficult. It's just not. I just have a real challenge trying to access that part of myself playfully, and I respect that. Obviously, everyone gives it their best shot. And yes, to the point that you made earlier, the whole notion of a clown is based around the very human experience of imperfection. And what clowning helps us to do is to notice that there is some invisible paradigm out there that's telling us that we need to do better and stop screwing up, and that so much of the healing that the clown offers us is the acceptance of the fact that we do screw up on a regular basis, and as per our earlier discussion, it might be a creative pathway. So, I think shame is absolutely fundamental to the art of clowning. Of course, as we said before, when trauma is involved, then there are, hoops that must be jumped through and things that must be respected. But nevertheless, generally speaking, if we're able to admit our flaws, which lead back to our judgment of our flaws, namely our shame, then we're able to kind of let a little something flow that has been bound very tightly.
I'd love it if we could fish for an example of someone who was really brought to their edge with getting into the shame clown, because again, similar to aggression, it's kind of counterintuitive. You think aggression, that's not funny.
Yeah.
So it's like shame. What? Shame? That's not my deepest wounds. Like when kids in middle school or whatever were making fun of me for my body, that's deep in my core. I'm wounded in there. That's not funny.
No,
I was wondering if we could fish for an example of somebody that was really edgy, for them to get into that place in that vulnerable place of offering the shame. And it just became the most hilarious thing for the entire group, including them.
I'll give an example, which comes to mind. A man, a mature young man, so he's probably in his late 30s, shows up in class with a real sense of his own value, like maybe just a little bit too much, confident, possibly cocky, and a nice guy, but still with a kind of a judgmental, almost cynical vibe based in his own pride. So his proud clown was a treat because he just took that to an exaggerated end, and he was like a ladies' man to end all ladies' men, and it was totally absurd and so on. That was great. But when it came to his shame clown, it was really different and difficult. What he ended up creating, which I loved and had a huge amount of potential in it, was a loser kind of soccer coach clown. There's a guy whose hair was all matted close to his head, and he was wearing clothes that were too big for him, and he had a whistle that didn't work, and he was in sort of ugly tracksuit pants. And you could tell that this particular individual was deeply uncomfortable in those clothes because he normally dressed pretty natty. He really had a good opinion of himself. But for him to show up as a loser was just utterly delightful. And then through the energetic vibration that he accessed, he began to kind of give up a lot. Like, forget it. As if to say, nah, I can't, I haven't got it, I'm useless. And the contrary here, the counterpoint to his natural self was so vivid and so delicious. Very simple example. But it became a really, really fruity kind of experiment. Now, curiously enough, we got to a point where it was time to do a show and to have an audience come and watch some clowning. And this particular guy said, I'm really interested in that shame clown. And he said, okay, sure. And after I said that to him, he wrote to me late at night one night. And he said, I think I'd rather do the other one. And I could tell that we had really hit a vulnerable place there, So it's not earth-shattering, but it's a great example of how our natural predisposition is challenged so beautifully by clowning. And shame is offers a really great opportunity.
Beautiful. I'm wondering, we're kind of rolling to a close here, but I really want to pick your brain about one final topic.
Please.
Is that all right?
Yeah, of course.
Okay. So I'm really fascinated in this inversion of the clown by Hollywood and various narratives into what we could call the evil clown. Like you have the image of the Joker, for example, and Periwinkle, and it's like, some of the teenagers out there are just there's actually a thing called coulrophobia in psychology, like a kind of a true phobia of clowns. Now, what do you think about this archetype of the evil clown? What does it have to do with? Because, in the early in the creation mythologies, for example, you see this moral ambivalence of the clown, but now we see the clown toggling into the archetype of evil. What do you reckon about that?
Well, I used to dismiss this topic because it just irritated me, but that was 10 years ago. And then through learning more and continuing to sort of stay curious, there's a Swiss clown by the name of Gardi Hatta who's very, very brilliant and extremely highly regarded. And she told me that her access point for clowning as a child was Carnival, which in Switzerland was very frightening. In her little village somewhere in the mountains, there were people dressed as sort of hideous gear that really their job was to frighten children, around these particular festival days. And you would be kind of walking down the path and suddenly one of these, strange headless creatures would hop out and scream at you. And I started to think about the so-called killer clown, and I began to understand it a little differently. It still performs a function of opposition, but it's just become more extreme. So I think to understand it, at least sort of philosophically speaking, it might behoove us to look at, shall we say, some of the extremes that we can witness in Christian fundamentalism, where the notion of goodness is taken to such a sort of narrow point that it becomes, perhaps, at least to secular folk like myself, might even be reductive, but nevertheless is kind of fanatical. So what's the opposition to the fanatical appearance of good in our society? Well, it would be the fanatical appearance of evil, which the clown helps us to represent. And I'm assuming, I don't partake of those films, but I don't go to any horror films, so that's just my taste. But I'm assuming that when you watch a film with a killer clown in it, you're supposed to be terrified out of your skin. That's the point. And so we were asking a larger question, really, which is, what is the function of horror in popular culture that helps to kind of lance whatever boil the culture has grown, whatever barnacle needs to be chipped off the mainframe? So I tend to think of it in those terms, and now it becomes much less of a frustrating topic and much more of an interesting one. And you hit it, Brian. You talked about the role of the trickster is morally ambivalent, sometimes at best. There are manifold examples of tricksters, behaving as either rascals or destructors, not that far away from the spirit of evil. Take a look at Loki in Scandinavian literature, or Scandinavian mythology, I should say, just chaotic, totally chaotic figure, or even Dionysus. Like, it's not pure evil by any stretch, but there's certainly a very powerful sense of chaotic disorder. And I think evil is just further along that continuum. It's also worth saying that in medieval mystery plays and morality plays, evil was personified through the character of Satan and his devils, plural, little kind of devil minions. And because they were the embodiment of folly, they were frequently portrayed in a very comical fashion because they did stupid things. They kept messing up. And lo and behold, they became the most popular characters in medieval morality plays, which is actually a problem for the church because that wasn't their intention at all. And by the time you get to the character of Vice, who's supposed to be, a sort of an instructor of how to live and a tutor to the population, you really actually have one of your first, shall we say, household name clowns, because Vice was hilarious and Vice was very attractive. Much more interesting. Would you prefer to go and see a play called The Seven Deadly Sins, or would you prefer to see a play called The Seven Heavenly Virtues? I mean, there's just no getting away from it, right? So, I think that evil clowning is actually on a continuum, even though it's a long way removed from what we think of as regular clown.
It's an ancient tradition, in the book you have here, I'm reading a little bit from Humanitarian Clowning here. You have the Hopi, Cherokee, Apache, Lakota, Navajo, Cheyenne, the medicine clowns, all being shapeshifters, an image of fluidity. You have Zuni clowns who consume excrement, eat live mice, drink their own urine, and the Hopi clowns who indulge in outrageous obscenities and phallic horseplay in their conservative communities. Their buffoonery conjures up the profane impulses that linger in the subconscious to welcome them and allow them to balance cosmically with the visible values of propriety and order. I'm thinking about, because there was such a equal power, just such a, chaos and order. I'm thinking about one of the Greek creation mythologies where you have, and literary tradition in ancient Greek mind was a lot about this polarity between what was called hubris and nemesis.
Yeah.
And nemesis was actually a goddess to be feared.
Interesting.
She was an anxious goddess to be feared. So that if you were succumbing to hubris and getting arrogant, you better watch out for nemesis.
Oh, I see.
Right?
Yeah, I see.
Do you see where I'm going with this? Like the image of you better be afraid. If you're being arrogant and grandiose, you better be afraid of the clown with teeth.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? So, and it would be good to have this fear in our society with all this grandiosity and rigidity and all of these, what I call the identity wars, so that the clown doesn't have as much power as it used to, not nearly as much. The clown needs its teeth again, and it needs to be able to be felt by the people as being more complex than just evil or just the buffoon, or just entertainment. But the clown is sacred, and it's an image of mobility and shapeshifting that can go play all these parts. But the aggressive part is like, listen, if you're being arrogant and grandiose, you better be afraid of the clown with teeth.
Yeah, I love that. I'm going to go hunting for that now, because I never thought of nemesis as the sort of opposite value, if you like, to hubris, but that's really brilliant.
Because she's not particularly funny. It's not a particularly funny image. Yeah. And either is the image of aggression. But if you think about it, like I love to study archaeology and evolution, it's, these great cataclysms, like, for example, the Nama and White Sea cataclysm. It was this huge evolutionary event. where oxygen levels on planet Earth went way up, and all the sea sponges on planet or in these assemblages, almost everybody died, basically. But then in the wake of that, you have this enormous explosion of creativity called the Cambrian explosion, where you have all these novel life forms and and that paved the way for the body plan that eventually gave us vertebrates like ourselves, right? So you have this evil catastrophe, and you see this in world mythologies all the time and literary traditions, where you see this big, bad, scary thing that happened, and then in the wake of that, you have an enormous creativity.
So my question to you then is, if you encounter catastrophe in the life of an individual, can it serve as a portal to rebirth?
I think that's what I think so. I think that's the other side, the celebratory side of healing a trauma, for example, that or like, for example, the journey of madness, which, a lot of the trickster figures expressed that intensity of madness, right? And some of the greatest Jungian psychologists know that madness isn't just all over the place and isn't just all over the place crazy. Sometimes it's an organic brain disease that's terminal, but other times it's really a rebirth. That psychosis is an incubation process, and it's a breaking down of old forms that's incubating new forms and the possibility for new expressions and new creativity. And I think that can be missing, right? The celebratory aspects of, hey, you're in a breakdown right now as a couple or as a family, and it's hard to celebrate because it's raw and it hurts and it's gnarly and things are, you feel like you're in the acid bath or something. But hey, yeah, I think it's pretty necessary this is just what nature does.
Yeah.
It just toggles back and forth between chaos and order.
That's right. Doing destruction.
And clown's just doing that, it's like, hey, let's not take it too seriously, the tragedies, right? Because, it's all just one absurd, magical, incredible gift, all of this stuff. And if we can just find a way to celebrate it together, we're doing good. The clown is a holy ally in this.
That's right. That's exactly right. Well said, sir.
Oh gosh, this was fun, David. I hope we get to do it again sometime. And so Michael Funt is your co-author, right? And also your collaborator down there in LA, right? At the Clown School.
That's right. He's back. He's currently in China. He's working over there, but he'll be back at the end of this year. So.
Yeah. So he does a lot of the mythological research and
he does
all of that, right?
Exactly.
Yeah. Brilliant. Well, I sure hope we get to collaborate more in the future. And thank you so much for.
Thank you for listening to The Boundless Body with the Somatic Doctor. Please leave a comment, subscribe, and like us on social media.
We're a swarm, we're a colony, we're a multiplicity.
Until next time, be well.